The United States already has one plan for the attack on Iran, not as a political statement, nor as a sensationalist prediction, but as a strategic construction that begins long before the first missile is launched. Plans of this kind don't arise from nothing. They take shape when internal crises, diplomatic windows, military calculations, and global interests begin to align simultaneously. Today, Iran is experiencing one of the most fragile phases of its recent history, while the United States is showing clear signs of strategic repositioning abroad. For analysts, what matters is not only whether an attack can happen, but why has this scenario become considered viable now? What would their real objectives be, and how would they be executed? Throughout this video, we will break down this plan in an organized and factual way, analyzing the internal Iranian context, the international environment, the military movements, and the scenarios that open up as a result of these decisions. If you value serious and straightforward analysis of what's really happening in the world, please like and subscribe to the channel. This greatly strengthens the channel and helps me bring content that doesn't usually appear in traditional media. Also, let us know where you're watching from. Now let's understand this whole situation. In early 2026, Iran ceased to be merely a recurring topic in international news and began to occupy a central place in global strategic analyses. This did not happen due to a single isolated event, but due to a rare convergence of internal and external factors that, when observed together, help explain why the country has once again entered the radar of major powers. Internally, the Iranian regime faces profound wear and tear after a wave of nationwide protests that exposed social, economic, and political fissures accumulated over decades. The state's response, marked by intense repression, deepened the loss of domestic legitimacy and accelerated the country's diplomatic isolation. Externally, this weakening occurs at a time when the international system is more unstable, with less room for accommodation and a greater willingness for decisive action. In the history of international relations, internal crises of this type often open windows of opportunity for external actors, not necessarily because they wish to intervene, but because they begin to assess that the cost of inaction may become greater than the cost of action. It is this logic more than any rhetoric that explains why Iran has returned to the spotlight now. If this initial reading makes sense to you, write the word "now" in the comments so I know you've been following the reasoning from the beginning. To understand the depth of this crisis, it is essential to look at the Iranian historical context. Since the Islamic Revolution, the regime has built its stability by combining ideological legitimacy, institutional control, and repressive capacity. In previous moments of tension, such as economic protests or internal political disputes, the state managed to reabsorb the shock by offering limited concessions or reinforcing control mechanisms without compromising the central power structure. What differentiates the recent cycle is the prolonged and decentralized nature of the demonstrations, as well as the social breadth of the groups involved. It is not just a matter of punctual dissatisfaction, but a broader questioning of governance, economic opportunities, and political representation. The state's response, by opting for comprehensive repression, drastically reduced its own options for de-escalation. When a government crosses this threshold, it signals to both the population and external observers that it no longer has sufficient political instruments to restore stability. This type of situation tends to erode the cohesion of the state apparatus itself, as different sectors begin to disagree not only on the means used, but on the strategic direction as a whole. As the crisis deepens, the regime's internal weaknesses become more visible. Tensions between political elites, religious leaders, and military structures are not uncommon in highly centralized systems, but they often remain latent while the center of power maintains effective control. In moments of simultaneous pressure, these tensions emerge with greater force. Issues related to succession, the chain of command, and the division of responsibilities in crisis scenarios begin to generate uncertainty. Highly repressive regimes face a dilemma known in political science. The more they depend on force to maintain themselves, the smaller their strategic room for maneuver becomes. Repression may contain demonstrations in the short term, but it weakens the capacity for adaptation in the medium and long term. For external actors, this is interpreted as a sign of structural vulnerability, not necessarily of immediate collapse, but of a progressive reduction in the state's capacity to respond. It is at this point that analyses cease to focus solely on what is happening within the country and begin to consider how these weaknesses interact with external pressures. If this explanation of structural vulnerability is clear, comment on the word history to indicate that the historical context helped to clarify the current scenario. This internal situation unfolds within a significantly more volatile international environment. In recent years, the United States has adjusted its foreign policy posture, demonstrating a greater willingness to act swiftly when it perceives clear strategic threats or opportunities. Recent precedents show that such decisions do not arise from momentary impulses, but from accumulated assessments of risk, credibility, and political cost. At the same time, other major powers have reacted more cautiously or in a fragmented manner, either due to economic limitations or competing domestic priorities. The result is a less predictable multipolar system, in which the absence of coordinated responses widens the scope for action of actors willing to take calculated risks. In this context, Iran is not seen in isolation, but as part of a broader chessboard involving regional stability, energy flows, and the balance of power. For American analysts, the central question is not only what happens inside Iran, but how this crisis connects to broader patterns of global competition and influence. Within this equation, regional actors play distinct and often contradictory roles. Gulf countries are following the situation with concern, especially due to the sensitivity of their energy markets to any prolonged instability. The security of export routes and critical infrastructure is of vital interest for these economies, which explains their cautious stance towards any escalation. Israel, in turn, observes the scenario from a predominantly defensive perspective, focused on containing direct threats and preserving its deterrent capacity. Other regional allies tend to limit their direct involvement, preferring to offer logistical, diplomatic, or defensive support rather than active participation. This diversity of interests shows that the region does not act as a homogeneous bloc, but as a set of actors who calculate risks individually. For the American public, understanding this dynamic is fundamental to understanding why certain decisions are made and others are avoided, even when the overall objectives seem to converge. If you've made it this far and better understand how regional interests shape global decisions, write region in the comments to reinforce this point. When considering these elements together, it becomes clear why the Iranian situation matters beyond its borders. It's not just about a country facing internal difficulties, but a point of intersection between domestic fragility and international strategic calculations. How this crisis unfolds will have direct implications for regional balance, energy security, and how future interventions will be evaluated and legitimized. Throughout the rest of this video, the analysis delves deeper into these developments, connecting military signals, political choices, and possible short- and medium-term scenarios, always aiming to make a complex issue understandable without resorting to simplifications or alarmism. Observing recent military movements is one of the most important tools for understanding strategic intentions, especially when governments avoid direct public statements. In the current case, the deployment of naval, air, and defensive systems towards the Middle East should not be interpreted as an isolated or symbolic gesture. Historically, this type of movement occurs when a state seeks to expand its strategic options, maintaining both deterrent capability and readiness to act. The presence of advanced naval assets, long-range aircraft, and air defense systems indicates preparation for a high-intensity environment, in which missile, drone, or aircraft attacks would be possible. At the same time, it is important to distinguish between a posture aimed solely at deterring an adversary and concrete preparation for offensive operations. When forces are positioned in an integrated manner, with the capacity to operate continuously and in a coordinated manner, the signal emitted tends to be more than just preventive. Another relevant aspect is what does not appear in this type of deployment: the absence of large land formations, typical logistics for prolonged occupation, or massive troop mobilization, suggests that this is not a traditional invasion plan. In strategic analyses, the absence of certain means is as informative as the presence of others, as it helps to define the type of action considered most likely. This set of signs points to the logic of a modern air campaign, which has become a central instrument of major powers since the end of the last century. Large-scale air operations usually have clear objectives: to reduce the adversary's military capacity, disrupt its chain of command, and send a strong political message without resorting to direct territorial occupation. In urban and industrial environments, precision strikes offer significant advantages as they allow for hitting specific targets with less collateral damage, at least compared to older methods. For this to work, control of airspace is fundamental. This involves neutralizing air defense systems, radars, and coordination centers that could threaten aircraft or missiles. This process, generally known as defensive suppression, seeks not only to pave the way for subsequent attacks, but also to demonstrate the adversary's inability to protect its own critical infrastructure. By prioritizing this type of approach, the attacker seeks to minimize human and political costs, reducing its own casualties and limiting the need for a prolonged presence on foreign soil. This logic helps explain why air campaigns are often chosen when the goal is to alter a regime's behavior or weaken it rapidly, without taking the risks associated with prolonged ground conflicts. If this explanation of the logic of a modern air campaign has helped you understand how military decisions are made, comment with the word aerial to indicate that this point is clear. The definition of targets in operations of this type follows well-established strategic criteria. Instead of indiscriminate attacks, priority is usually given to command and control centers, which are responsible for coordinating military and security forces. By compromising these centers, the attacker seeks to generate confusion, delays, and communication failures that reduce the adversary's response capacity. Critical military infrastructure, such as air bases, equipment depots, and logistical support facilities, are also usually among the first targets as they underpin the state's operational capacity. In addition, strategic and symbolic economic assets may be considered, not only for their material impact but also for the political value they represent. Facilities linked to energy production, for example, have importance that goes beyond the domestic economy, affecting regional and global markets. Another recurring focus is on internal repressive and security forces, especially when these structures play a central role in maintaining the regime. By weakening these apparatuses, the campaign seeks to reduce the state's ability to control the population internally, creating additional pressures that do not depend exclusively on the military field. These criteria reveal that the choice of targets is not random, but guided by broader political and strategic objectives that go beyond simple physical harm. No analysis of this kind would be complete without considering the civilian factor, which is often the most unpredictable element in crisis scenarios. The relationship between external action and internal popular mobilization is complex and depends on multiple cultural, historical, and social variables. In some cases, external attacks can strengthen the regime by fueling nationalist narratives and consolidating internal support. In others, especially when the government's legitimacy is already deeply shaken, external shocks can alter the balance of fear, encouraging sectors of the population to resume protests or forms of resistance that had been interrupted. This cascading effect is not guaranteed and has clear limits. Civil uprisings face logistical, organizational, and coordination challenges, as well as the constant risk of repression. At the same time, a rapid collapse of state structures can generate fragmentation, internal disputes, and even prolonged violence, as recent examples in different regions of the world demonstrate. Therefore, the human element is treated by analysts as a strategic variable capable of accelerating or complicating predicted scenarios. Understanding these dynamics is essential to assess not only the beginning of a crisis, but also its possible trajectories. If this section about the role of the population and internal pressure helped you understand the risks and limitations involved, write civil in the comments to show that this point made sense. When projecting possible scenarios, analysts often work with some general guidelines without intending to predict exact outcomes. One of the scenarios discussed is that of a relatively rapid regime change, in which the combination of external pressure and internal mobilization leads to the collapse of the central government. This type of outcome tends to generate expectations of accelerated political reconfiguration, but also carries significant risks of short-term instability. Another scenario considers prolonged instability, in which the regime loses some of its control capacity but remains in power, resulting in a period of uncertainty, internal conflicts, and persistent economic difficulties. The consequences of these developments are not limited to the country in question. Regional impacts may include changes in the balance of power, shifts in existing alliances, and chain reactions in neighboring countries. Globally, effects on energy markets, trade flows, and political precedents are closely watched as they influence future decisions in other regions. For the American public, understanding why the outcome of this process matters beyond the Middle East is fundamental. It affects international credibility, the stability of strategic partners, and how similar crises may be handled in the future. It is this systemic view, which connects local events to global consequences, that allows us to assess the true dimension of what is at stake without resorting to alarmism or oversimplification. When observing all these elements together, it becomes clear that what is at stake goes far beyond a single country or an isolated decision. We are facing a moment where internal fragilities, strategic calculations, and transformations in the international system converge, creating effects that spread in multiple directions. Understanding this scenario is not about predicting the future with certainty, but about recognizing patterns, limits, and possible consequences. How this situation evolves will influence the regional balance, relations between major powers, and how similar crises will be handled from now on. For those who follow geopolitics, this is one of those inflection points that helps explain broader changes in the world we live in. If you've made it this far, it's because you're really paying attention to what's happening behind the headlines. So leave a like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next analyses, and comment, "I'm paying attention," so I know who watched until the end. And stay tuned, because in the next video, which is already on screen, we will delve even deeper into this scenario with an essential topic for understanding the current moment. The New World Order has begun,